Well, happy Tuesday morning, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I just appreciate you being with me so very, very much. Don't forget, in less than a week now, I'll be debating Dr. Jaime Pickett in a formal YouTube debate. It will be carried live, and of course it will be archived afterwards in case you can't watch it. It will also be carried, hopefully, live on Facebook. So be watching for that. And once again, we'll be posting the links and all that kind of technical stuff that I don't understand just as soon as it can get be set up, okay? Well, we are looking at the fact that Paul said the body is sown in dishonor. It is raised in honor. Now, you need to go back and you need to be sure to watch the videos on shame versus glory. But in the last video, and a previous video to that even, I took note of the fact that the enemies of covenant eschatology very often level the charge of Gnosticism against preterists, since preterists deny that there will yet be a future physical, biological raising of decomposed bodies out of the ground. I pointed out to you that in my last video, that charge is really quite irresponsible, it is quite ill-informed, and it may very well be, on the part of some individuals, it may just simply be a false claim. So the question is raised then, what does Paul mean when he says the body is sown in dishonor? Did Paul, in fact, have a Gnostic form of Gnostic thinking? Well, here's something you need to know. Paul has been accused of being a quasi-Gnostic. But it's absolutely false. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there for your consideration. Gnosticism did not arise until the 2nd century. It was not even a 1st century doctrine. Do you catch the power of that? The scholarly consensus in the world today is Gnosticism did not exist in the 1st century. Well, guess what, folks? If Gnosticism was not a problem in the 1st century, then it's a little bit, anachronistic to charge Paul or John or anyone else with being a Gnostic. Okay, but do you notice that Paul in Galatians chapter 3, he says, have you begun in the Spirit? Are you now made perfect by the flesh? What? Paul, what are you talking about? Flesh? Spirit? In Romans chapter 8, let's go back to chapter 7. As Paul spoke of his internal struggle, the struggle of Israel under Torah, probably, and certainly he as an individual included. But he says, I have a war going on in my members. To will that which is good I find, but to do that which is good I do not find. And that which I would not do, that's what I do. And he says, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? What? Paul, are you longing to be out of the physical body? Well, guess what? If Paul was actually longing to be out of the physical body, that doesn't really support the futurist view of a physical resurrection, does it? But you see, Paul was not talking about a body of substance, of physical flesh, versus a Casper-like body. He is thinking in purely Hebraic forms, that a man, according to the way he was living in a body of life or a body of death. And the body of death that he's talking about right there was the life in which there was no forgiveness, there was no salvation, and thus he realized, not because his human flesh was frail, but he realized that he was dead if he was alienated from God. In Romans 8, he continues and he says, I've often had a lot of fun with this passage. You are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. What, Paul? He's writing to living, breathing human beings who are in biological bodies of flesh, but he tells them, you are not in the flesh. And he says, if any man is in the flesh, he cannot please God. Well, there you go. We might as well give up. We cannot please God if we are in the flesh. Now think about this, folks, how Paul uses the word and term flesh. If you are in the flesh, you cannot please God. You are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. And think about a term that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. We'll have more to say about that later. But I hope that you can see that when Paul talks about flesh, when he talks about spirit, when he is using these terms that people insist refers to biological flesh versus Casper, the ghost, they're not using those terms in the way that Paul used them. And Paul was not using them in some pre-Gnostic way either. He was talking about two realms of existence, two realms of life, two ways of living. A way of living after the flesh, which meant you were of the flesh and in the flesh, but not biologically, versus living in the Spirit, which meant living a life in submission to the will of God. This is how Paul uses these terms, flesh versus spirit. And that's why this agrees and comports perfectly when Paul says, when the mortal shall put on immortality, or the corruptible, and he uses this word phathora versus aphathora, which the corruption had to do with moral corruption, i.e. a life of flesh, versus aphathora, a life devoted to God and a life in submission to God. So it's critical for us to use the terms in the way Paul uses. Look, preterists are accused all the time of redefining biblical words. Well, let me tell you something. It's time that we go back to the Bible and we define the Bible words, terms, and phrases in the way that they were originally intended, not the way modern dictionaries define them. It is absolutely amazing when modern commentators come to these words, terms, and phrases in 1 Corinthians 15 and they totally ignore how Paul uses those very words, terms, and phrases. And they impose a definition on those words, terms, and phrases that do not work. Simply do not work. And guess what? We've got more on these important, critical words, and even on the concept of Gnosticism. And we'll look at that on the flip side. We will see you there.